No problem. Test. Hello, everyone, again, and welcome to the Forest stage here at ETH Berlin. Not ETH Berlin. My brain is all messed up. Welcome to ETH Barcelona, the Forest stage. Our next speaker is actually Andrej Berlin. Come on up.
Cool. Heyo, thanks for coming around. Today I'm going to talk about organizational, hey Anna. Today I'm going to talk about organizational design. I hope that by the end of the next 20 minutes I'll give you an intro to either how to approach starting an organization or just improve what you currently have. Before I start, I want to emphasize and kind of thank everybody who was so far contributing to the organization. There was Deep Work is a design studio that I built over the last 4 years, and even though it's completely permissionless, nobody has any contracts, nobody needs to work, still we managed to design over 40 different projects, a lot of them you already know, and most importantly, these individuals, regardless of whether they're actual designers or just contributors, were active participants in a system that I was able to kind of evaluate and design for. By the way, how many of you are freelancers or have a business? All right, interesting, nice, okay, cool. The reason I'm asking is because I see a tendency for people kind of shifting away from, I mean, it's a clear tendency from people shifting away from jobs into something that's more self-sufficient or freelance or creating their own business for reasons of like loss of meaning at work, and I think they're right. The reason for that is probably, or most likely, because our entire economy is built on the premise of work being a disutility, something that people don't really prefer to do, but then to afford leisure. And I think that's kind of interesting because there is a story of how work actually evolved. Before the Middle Ages, work was just normal part of life, like sleep and eat. In the Middle Ages, Christian chauvinists decided to tie the connotation of work to the idea of being a good person. So if you're a good person and you do the work, profits go to the church decides how to distribute it across the poor, God thinks that's a cool thing, and so that's why you're a good person. The same mentality is also translated over to the industrialization, except now factory owners distribute the profits as they wish. And if you're only kind of a sustainable part of society if you do work, regardless of whether you like it or not. And neoclassical economists basically took that model and started understanding that that is how the economy must work, because that's why it flourishes, that's why people buy things, etc. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because I don't think that if we want to approach organizational design, we should start with that kind of premise, but rather with the idea that work can be something that's meaningful and that's actually something that people like to do or kind of connect to the purpose of, like to collaborate with their individuals and also feel fairly compensated, which is kind of the freedoms that we have in freelance, except, you know, we need to kind of figure out ways how to do it together. And the path to that direction is actually always quite fuzzy. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but generally every freelancer or any business owner has to go through that process of basically innovating on stuff and figuring out what exactly it is that provides value. There's an easy example with, I don't know, 2017, there was VR. People were like, okay, we think we have the next metaverse technology, but in reality, they were a lot earlier in the stage, and they were just like completely in chaos, and only kind of now we know, we can specifically tell as external observers that VR is probably only useful for games and like industry applications and porn, at least so far. Of course, I'm not saying that it's not going to develop, but generally the tendency of evolving any technology works like that. And Apple is actually very good at kind of embodying that process, so they have a really good process of prototyping and user testing. That's why their products become so innovative and actually useful over time. And yeah, so essentially, if you want to get to that point, like this is just a very brief outline. You want to focus on the things that you're good at. So get confidence in your abilities to perform something well, specialize on it, and also productize it. And if you take these three things and you kind of bounce them off of your environment, being your clients or stakeholders, and assign a certain cost or price, then you develop your actual expertise in your product. And that's how this whole evolution kind of goes further and further. And it's important to start with the things that you do well, so not just like delegate to someone else, and also to start relatively small, like you know probably the example from Amazon that started with books, or Slack that started to solve their own problem only, and only then, like later, slowly, they kind of emerge into something bigger and bigger and bigger. I'm saying that because I work a lot with teams who generally try to kind of develop something that's really big and that's really impactful, and that's a great aspiration. But the reality is that these steps are very, very kind of small and start on a very small scale. The second thing I want to, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you have a team and everybody focuses on their expertise, then you get kind of the positive sum collaboration, and then you have like a much bigger impact over time. Like that's unique to collaboration. The second thing that I want to mention is transparency, which you all know as something that's the value of Web3. Everything should be open source, everything should be transparent, but I think it's particularly relevant for collaboration across people or for organizations. So far, it's been kind of locked in, and business models were relatively hidden. But I think if you want to avoid the stress of hiring people or recruiting people or not knowing exactly who to work with, then the only way to kind of progress there is to show people exactly what you're working on, so like in terms of projects, and who is working on what, as transparently as possible, and also kind of as nicely communicated as possible, not just like a couple of documents, but actually specify exactly what it is you're working on and what the roles are. I'm also a big proponent, by the way, Ray Dalio from Bridgewater or McKinsey, they're very, very good at this. Of course, they're keeping it in close, but I think with Web3 we have the opportunity to make that a lot more public, and I'll go into that in a moment, what that could look like or what that actually means. I'm also a big proponent of being very transparent about financial data. So, of course, there's a spectrum of things that you want to keep private because they're prone to misinterpretation, but then there is another, the tendency should be to push towards transparency as much as possible. And there's an economic researcher called Robert Axelrod who is famous for the game theoretic approach to say that if you have a system where every player is transparent about their strategy, you basically reach an equilibrium. So I think that kind of applies to basically any data that you want to create. So what that also helps with, and this is also what McKinsey is actually very good at, is essentially this process of onboarding. So essentially by being transparent about things, you're replicating what an online forum is rather than a business, or like rather than a traditional locked up business. So you actually start attracting people to do the work, and then by creating relationships, by having mentors, that makes a lot of things a lot easier. And at the same time, sorry, I have a sore throat. At the same time, if you have so this is all not necessary for Web3 tools. So you don't need any like blockchain-based tooling. Deep work works mostly on Gitbook and Google Sheets or Notion and a couple of other tools that I'll mention later. But the principles and the actual tools to make that happen are all there. Of course, if we apply Web3 technology to that, it's going to make it a lot more scalable. And then we can talk about things like portable reputation, where if you provide people with the ability to understand and be transparent about what they're working on, then you also have an immutable asset that proves that someone has been working on something, makes them easier to find jobs in the future. Of course, that's also something that is where it's important to keep privacy in mind, because people don't want to share always everything about what they're working on. That's where zero knowledge proofs come in quite handy. So I think the general kind of idea of what decentralized organizations should look like, and by the way, I don't think that DAOs really exist yet. I think Bitcoin is maybe one of them. But the general tendency is that we should want to have kind of the social, the permissionlessness of the online communities that we have, like Reddit or Facebook groups or your favorite forum, combined with traditional organizations, so businesses that have a very specific social dynamic and amazing, thank you so much. And businesses that have a very specific value structure. Thanks. There's, by the way, also really good research from block science on the so-called viable system model. You should look up to it, or you should look it up. It's a very good model to actually understand how these organizations or like organizational design works in order to make it look more like a biological system. So it's more like replicating certain ways how people interact with each other that's closer to a biological mechanism. It's more of a framework, and I'm not going to go into this in this presentation, but I'm also happy to elaborate on that later. It's really, really specific about how an organization can be almost like fractalized and scale into infinity with some very particular rules. So in order to actually kind of approach the design, this is like probably the most designy part about this kind of presentation. So in order to design, there's actually just one thing that I think everybody should keep in mind, regardless of what you're designing. You always start by observing. Well, first of all, you throw kind of a hypothesis out of what you think a community is supposed to do. The pink dots are, imagine this people, and the text is obviously like activities that they do. So you throw out a hypothesis of what people want to be doing, and then you observe what they're doing in your community. And then based on their kind of activities, and based on your observation, you want to combine essentially what you think is good for everybody with what people are seeing as an activity that they want to do. And that's how you basically design for like meaningful work or delightful activities. I put in the ETH Launchpad here as an example because essentially it's the same process of designing a digital product, except you're not designing an interface, a UI, but you're just like designing kind of the constraints and borders of how people are supposed to interact. And it's even more important if you involve things like financial assets and tokens, or like that particular approach, because if you don't, and if you just throw up a token on Uniswap, say it has some value, and that represents what our community is, and then let's drive from there, and the government finds out your name, then you go to jail. You don't want to go to jail, because you have to basically find out first what the value exchange is between individuals, and then map that onto and then design monetary policies along these systems. That's what a token is actually just representing. It's just like a more scalable way of what's already going on. The last part that I want to kind of touch on is probably the deepest and probably most important if you want to achieve something like a self-regulating organization or like a self-sufficient organization that does mimic a biological organism. And this is purely from my experience building the design studio. And I would also say that it closely maps to the viable system model that I just mentioned, is essentially transitioning from work stream-based work, where you just like do work over time, into something that's very, very specific. So you basically focus on being very, very specific about projects and what the projects consist of, so that first of all, people obviously know what's going on, but then with the goal of actually creating recurring projects that always have an iteration loop. So you start with something, you start with like some first criteria, and then people work on a project with a specific process, outcome, and duration. Again, like said earlier, you take these things, you compare them to what your environment actually needs, Maybe you want to calculate the cost, like one example would be to just count the hours it takes, compare it to the market rate, add the profit margin, and now you have the price, and then you see, does the client or stakeholder want to pay for that? And then you go back and forth, and basically in that loop you refine the process or the project. But if you do that on any domain, essentially every single thing that, or your organization, any single group that your organization is involved in, gets better and better, not only personally, but also as a collective, and also the quality of the projects are going to improve. I know these concepts are not like super novel, but what is kind of useful, or what we have the potential to explore here, is actually the way to make that really scalable and open and accessible for everybody. So that way, I mean, generally projectizing everything helps people also to kind of feel fairly compensated. Again, this is like an asset that people can carry around as part of their reputation. And they start focusing also a lot on the actual social networks, because there's no long-term contracts, there's no long-term commitments. People know that what they have to value is the actual social relationships, because they know that any time at any project, they could be excluded from the organization. And so, at least in deep work, that's kind of the dynamic that emerges. People are really nice to each other and are working really towards something together that brings value to everyone. The last thing, of course, everybody has a different perspective on what a project consists of. I just kind of call it soft governance. If you have a lot of people and you want to define what a project looks like, then everybody has a different opinion. Soft governance is kind of a term for basically making decisions together, as opposed to using like algorithmic governance or token-based governance. So having actual agreements, I think design thinking is an amazing tool that helps align people on something together, but then also make decisions really, really fast. So you don't dick around and wait for things to happen, or have one-on-one conversations forever that go into all directions, but you actually get people together, make decisions with them, everybody agrees, or at least they reach a shared range of preference in their decisions, in their collaborative decisions, and then everybody can move on without having to wait for anyone else or feel not included. That's the problem with like token-based governance. So yeah, there's a lot of really good tools for all these things. I know that a lot of people are kind of interested in which tools to use for organizational design. Again, most of these things are just not that spectacular. I use Asana because it lets you schedule projects and just show them publicly, or Notion, same thing. It lets you even explore exactly all the details. Another tool that I use is called Sobel, which is just generally a very nice perspective on roles and who is involved in what. Depending on your organization, you can kind of map out who's doing which kind of work and let people actually explore what it looks like. This is based on concepts from holacracy and sociocracy, which is a very dynamic way to actually structure teams. So that's maybe also something that I would recommend looking up. And again, don't have the time to go into here, but it lets you kind of design an organization that's a lot more focused on making decisions together rather than having like strict leadership or a lot of management bloat. We're also building a tool right now. It's still an MVP, but it already works. Like, you can check it out. It basically covers a lot of these concepts of project-based work, reputations, and basically a way to manage people and hire people into an organization where the value exchange is already specified. You can check it out, but most importantly, if you have any feedback, please let me know. It's still a work in progress, or if you also like to get involved in the project, also very happy to onboard you. So I hope this gave you a little bit of an overview, and it obviously barely scratches the surface of what's possible. And I hope that it gives you a little bit of an idea of what things to explore when you want to design your organization. Covered innovation, transparency, design for emergence, project-based work, soft governance. If you're interested in any more of these topics, you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter, where I post like shorter videos and content on any of these things. over the next time. And last but not least, thank you so much for your interest in design and DAO design. Who's next?